Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're sitting down with Karl Forehand, who wrote a number of books. His latest that we're going to talk about today is called Out into the Desert and was co authored with his lovely wife, Laura, who's not able to be with us today. But, Karl, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you back.
Thanks, man. It's a good pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So, Out into the Desert, the subtitle is Thriving Outside of Organized Religion. And I feel like we have a lot of things to talk about, but
Yeah.
let's start with the title. Maybe give our listeners a teaser about what this book is about, along with maybe a little bit about your target audience and why you and Laura decided to write this book together.
Yes, we've always talked in the Desert Sanctuary and so on about when you start to question things, when you start to evaluate your Christianity or your religion, and you ask two or three questions, and it begins to feel like you're just wandering out into the desert.
Mhm.
And so when I stepped away from being a pastor somewhere around 2016, was because I couldn't do it anymore. I was questioning too many things, and I just felt separated from my body and didn't um, wasn't in any kind of state to be a pastor
Mhm.
over a congregation. So we attended a big church for a while, like you do, to kind of hide out. And it, if I told you the name, you would know it. But we attended there for a couple of years, and Laura talks about it vividly in the book about us fighting on the way there because she had been done with organized religion for a while,
Mhm.
and I was still trying to fix it. I still thought, I can get involved and I can fix these problems that I see. But someone encouraged us to take a year off to step back, and kind of take a look at organized religion. And eventually we did that. We tried to go to a little Methodist church by our house, and that didn't work. But so sometime, around the beginning of 2020, like early pandemic kind of thing, we sit down and try. We've always talked about, we need to reimagine religion. We need to reimagine Christianity. Um, but Rob Bell talks about it like it's a fish standing by the ocean, is the analogy he uses.
Mhm.
When you're in the water, when the fish is in the water, it can't really see the water. It's too close
Mhm.
to the water, and it doesn't have a good perspective. So I kind of sat down and coerced Laura into helping me take a real honest look
Mhm.
at religion in the 21st century. How the money's spent. Um, are we addicted to church?
Mhm.
What about evangelism? Is that a real thing? Um, are people getting well there? Are people
Mhm.
getting better,
Yeah.
or are they not?
Yeah.
And one of the chapters is called "Would Jesus Go to Church?" We looked at purity culture because, and that one was titled "How Religion Ruined My Sex Life,"
Mhm.
or something like that. But also in that evaluation, I wouldn't say it's a scientific evaluate. I'm not a professor or anything like that, but it was an honest look, and what came out of that was our stories
Mhm.
and the real life things and the painful things that happened to us. And so then the second part was kind of about the thriving and just kind of an honest look at are we faking ourselves out, or are we
Mhm.
really thriving out here? Because it felt like we were.
Yeah.
So we kind of sat on the shelf for 2 years while we're going through my stroke recovery.
Mhm.
We I read it to Laura on the way back there and back. It was a 2-hour drive, and so we decided we still liked it. We wrote an afterword because of 2020. There's a
Mhm.
lot of things that happened in 2020, and we just still felt after 2 years that it's maybe worse now than it was,
Mhm.
and we need to do something. So anyway, it's for nomads, people that are out in the desert, but it gives language to them, like you were talking about before.
Mhm.
People will say, "Me too." That's what I went through.
Yep.
But also, a lot of people deconstructed to a certain point and maybe jumped back into church
Mhm.
and maybe went to a more woke church or something, a more progressive church. I think it's for them too, because you need to really honestly look at, have I deconstructed far enough?
Yeah.
And we address that a little bit. But also, I think for religious people who are deeply committed to church, like the fish, maybe you need to take a step back and really honestly look at it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it really challenges you to take a look at things that you probably don't think too much about, like you said, when you're up close to it Sunday
Mhm,
after Sunday or week after week. And that's what I appreciated the most about it. Now, in the intro, you talk about how you came to this place where you began to feel increasingly like out of place in the church.
mhm,
Now, I was wondering if you could tell me more about that inner experience for yourself, because I've had a similar experience. A lot of listeners have reached out to say kind of the same thing, that regardless of whether they go to a conservative church or a more progressive thinking church that kind of welcomes questions, whatever, they still feel like they're this square peg in a round hole. So I was wondering if you could
mhm.
tell me more about what it means for you to feel out of place in the church.
Yeah, one of the reasons was because Laura was done a long time ago. That's what the fights were about on the way to, it was Brian Zahn's church. That's where we
Mm,
were going.
yeah.
Nothing wrong with his church, just, you know, but she was done. I
Yeah.
mean, the things that I stood up against and fought, that shrapnel hit my family.
Hmm.
And so she was just wounded and done, with it. And I was beginning, I went through some spiritual direction training with some Benedictine sisters. And I was starting to open up to that healing,
Hmm.
and once you began to feel that, then you go to a church. Maybe it's a fairly good church, but it still has a tendency to bypass over issues like that. It doesn't
Yeah.
have time
Yeah.
for issues like that. Um, I can't, like you mentioned, I can't go to Bible study and ask a lot of questions. And that's what I think I would be doing. I said, wait a minute, what about this?
Right.
And I don't want to be that person.
Mhm.
You kind of feel some of the phoniness. Um, and I think one of the biggest things for me, really deep down, is I know that people are wounded. I know they go to church because they're wounded.
Mhm.
And I know the church wants to help with their woundedness, but systemically, it's like racism. It's broken.
Yeah.
It's a broken system that's not addressing those issues. And honestly, it's painful to watch that once you kind of understand it. And so there's just so many ways like that that it no longer felt right
Yeah.
anymore. So
Yeah.
that's where I was at. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that really speaks to me, because I mean, thinking about, we haven't been to church in, I think it's been almost 5 years now. And we tried a couple of like progressive churches and churches that were open to the word deconstruction, even churches that went to the Wild Goose Festival and like were
Hmm.
really, kind of in all of this stuff. But even in those places, like I remember saying to my wife, like I just feel like this constant need in the church to prove myself. Like I feel like I always have to prove my
Hmm.
ideas or my theology or what I think about God. I have to have a verse to back this up. Like it seems to be like this, the nature of the church. Like I'm just so tired of that kind of life and that kind of faith. Like I
Hmm.
just want to be, and I just
Hmm.
want to
Yeah.
exist, and I just want to evolve and kind of be like the ocean. Like, I just want to follow the
Yeah.
waves wherever they may lead me, and
I like
with
all those
God.
words. I like
Yeah.
all those words you're saying.
Yeah, so I was like, I
They're my
just feel like I
words.
I don't fit here anymore, which
Yeah.
seems so weird, because that's all I ever wanted to do with my life, was to be a pastor and to be in the
Mhm.
church. And now to look
Yeah.
back over the last 5 years of not being in church, it feels so odd to have
Mhm.
really made that my whole focus, my whole life. And now here I
Yeah.
am wanting nothing to do with it.
Yeah. Indeed.
So you have
Yes.
a quote on page 16 I wanted to read for our listeners. Let me pull it up on my screen. And then maybe you could respond to it. We kind of touched on it already, but you said that the church is described as a family. But what if we are neglecting our current family because we're always searching for the next addition to our clan? What if the
Mhm.
lost sheep is really within the people that already attend, What if the most recent drop in our membership is due to a valid problem within the organization that we don't have the time to address? What if the wounded are hobbling out one door as we greet the new members coming into the other? I was wondering if you talk to me about this because
Mm,
I remember I felt this as a pastor, Carl. Like, this is one of those things where you were talking in the book, and I'm like, oh yes, like this puts a lot of
mhm,
words on what I was feeling. But I remember like very distinctly one Sunday morning, I was standing in the pulpit and we were singing a hymn or something like that. I remember feeling this pressure. We had like an elder meeting the week before, and like this
mhm,
pressure from the board to grow the church, right? Like to do outreach events. They're always like, you got to bring the kids in because the more kids there are, the more
mhm,
they're gonna bring the parents, and the parents bring the money, and like all this different stuff. I remember standing there looking out over the congregation and looking at the people who are already in the pews.
mhm.
Like one man, his son committed suicide. We had another guy who was like a known alcoholic in the church. Another guy lost his job. Somebody
Yeah,
struggling with cancer. I remember thinking to myself, like the lost sheep, like you said, that they're right here. Like, why on
right.
earth do we need to go look for more lost sheep when we're doing,
Mhm,
quite frankly, a lousy job at caring for the ones who are already here? And I remember, like, that was around the time I started to feel really disillusioned about like evangelism and outreach and church growth models because most churches I think really aren't stewarding, for lack of a better word, like stewarding the pain very well in their pews, well
mhm.
enough to bring even more people in with more stories and more baggage. And
Right.
does that make any sense to you? Like when I was
Yeah,
reading that, all
absolutely.
this all these thoughts were coming to my head while I was reading that.
Yeah. So the I think that chapter's called The Main Thing because we
Yep.
always said evangelism is the main thing.
Hmm.
My denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, the former leader, when numbers were down, a couple million in that big, huge organization,
Hmm.
his quote was, "Well, what we need to do is just go evangelize. We need
Yeah.
to get in." And the church becomes kind of like a multi-level marketing group, where we got to keep bringing people in because they're hobbling out the other door.
Yeah.
And 70% of the money, 70% of the time is spent on salaries, buildings, producing the show on Sunday morning. Probably the most extreme examples of that are, places like Hillsong
Hmm.
and Driscoll, where it's just this emphasis on numbers and more, more, more. Um, Sarah Bessie um, said something one time. She said, "The church doesn't have room for my grief,"
Mm,
and
that's
that's
right.
been a tremendous statement in our evaluation of organized religion.
Mm,
I would never say that a pastor or a church has bad intentions because
mm,
most of them don't.
sure.
They don't.
Yeah.
But it's just like any other business. It's a constant struggle while you're trying to grow the business, gain new business, to take care of your clients you already have, to make it kind of crass, but at at least spend the time. If Glenn comes into church on Sunday morning deeply wounded about something, the show's still going to go on.
Yeah.
It's got to go on, and um, may be able to meet with the pastor a week from Thursday. He may not be equipped to help you anyhow.
Mhm.
All of those things. It's just a big systemic thing that doesn't really care for its family members
Yeah.
because it has to grow. It has to be growing because people are leaving.
Yeah, it's just like you have to make up for the new people, for the people who are leaving. You have to get more people. If they get 2 more people in for every person
Mhm,
that left, that's what it constantly felt like. And I just remember the pressure. Like we weren't married yet, but I remember calling up like my wife after meetings. It was my fiance at the time and saying like I don't know how much longer I can do this. Like I just feel
mhm,
like it's this constant pressure to find more people and to get more people. And yet there's these people sitting right in front of me that just I know aren't getting what they need. And I
mm,
feel like I'm not equipped to give it to them myself. But like, I feel like there's nobody else to help. It's like, and it's
yeah,
like I feel like all of my time is divided. And then, like you said, we have these Sunday morning worship services, which can be magical and amazing, but at the same time, there's so much of your time that's devoted every week to putting this theater thing together, like you said,
Mhm, mhm.
and so much of that time is and energy is poured into that, that there's so many other things and other people that just aren't getting touched and aren't getting helped. And I feel like it's
Right,
just not only do we not allocate, I think, our money very well when it comes to churches, but also our time.
right. And that, there's nothing wrong with the show.
Mhm.
I like going to concerts. I like going to shows. It changes my emotional level. It and that's kind of why I become addicted to it.
Mhm.
But in our diet, there's nothing wrong with having ice cream cone every once in a while. It's just that's not the only thing, and that
Right.
can't be the main thing.
That's right.
The main thing has got to be people and healing and finding relief from the things they're struggling with, and
Yeah.
that takes a lot of time and a lot of energy, that it seems like the church just doesn't have.
So true. So you talk in the book about the church needing to admit its failures, look at
Mhm.
its failures, talk about its failures, admit them. And you mentioned it a few times in the book, but I was wondering if you could talk to us a bit about why that's important. And I'm curious because I've heard this a lot of times before, and I had said it when I was a pastor too, that we should look back at our history and kind of come to grips with our failures. But what would you say to the person or the elder board or the pastor who is maybe listening or whatever, and they're thinking to themselves, well, focusing on our failures is kind of a waste of time
The
because
sleeping
that's
dogs lie.
yeah, it's looking backwards, like, that's already done, let it
Yeah,
go, we can repent, we can confess, whatever, but it's time to move on and look in
yeah,
tomorrow and the future, things like that. What's your response to that type of argument?
yeah. So my first book was kind of about parenting and how I related that to God.
Yep.
My children know that I made mistakes. My children know that I didn't do everything perfect. And Laura and I talk a lot about how much grace they give us.
Mm,
But I still look back at all my years of parenting and I see the most significant moments in that experience was when I said, "You know what? I'm sorry.
yeah,
I really screwed up. I did this wrong."
mhm,
And that changed our relationship. There's in the four agreements, they talk about acceptance. And at first, I don't want to like that word acceptance
mhm,
because it sounds kind of like a cop out,
mhm,
when you say, I just need to accept this. What I've been kind of learning over the last few months, maybe over the last year, is that acceptance is more than that. Acceptance is saying to the situation and saying to what we're going through, this is what it is.
mhm,
And until you can do that, there's no way to process it correctly. You have to accept things for what they are. And anytime you bypass or ignore, we just push things down and make shadow and all kinds of problems. My denomination, SBC, um, believes they're right. They believe God's on their side. And so they tend to say that this can't be our fault,
mhm,
because we're right and God's on our side and we pray and we do mission work and we're the biggest.
mm,
Um, but until you take that honest evaluation and say, you know, what's really true?
mm,
What is about me that's not right? And if I don't admit that, um, what's unfelt is unchanged. But when it's felt, it changes. So you have to feel it. You have to experience it, and say this is what we're doing wrong. This is what we did wrong. This is why it can't go on any longer. No
yeah,
matter what it costs us, we lose everything. Have to
oh,
be real,
yeah,
right?
yep, it's my phone,
That's all right.
which, it's funny because my camera is my phone, there we go. And, it rings sometimes, even though I thought I turned it off, so oh, well,
It's all
sorry about
right.
that.
Fine.
But I think that's it's really important because, I remember when I pastored the church I pastored was an old Reformed church, and it was built in, like, the I think it was the building itself, I think was built in the early 1800s. And so it was there for a long time. And we had this like memory room, that was full of all the memories of the church going all the way back, like different artifacts and different things. I remember I said to the elder board and deacon board one night, we had a meeting. So I feel like there's a great opportunity for us to go into that room together. And we weren't all here in the 1800s, obviously. We don't really know what's going on, but I feel like there's something we can go in there prayerfully, mindfully. We can listen to the spirit, and we can ask the spirit to show us maybe different mistakes that were made or different things that maybe the way maybe our church has hurt the community in some way. Who knows? Whatever it is, who knows what the spirit might bring up in the moment. And there was just such resistance to this idea that
Mhm.
we could possibly have done anything wrong. And so many people are like, well, I wasn't part of the problem. So why should I have to go and do all these things? There's just such this pushback against looking back at our mistakes. And I remember I said to them, I said, well, we push the congregation to look at their own mistakes
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
to repent before God and to do all these things. Like if we're pushing individuals to do that in the pews, why shouldn't we as an institution or as a system or as a church or whatever, why shouldn't we be doing the same thing? Like shouldn't we be modeling for the people
Mhm.
the very thing that we're asking them to do? Like and doesn't wouldn't we all argue that life works so much better when we own our mistakes and we learn from our mistakes so we move on to make tomorrow different? Like it just seems so logical to me, right?
Right, right. I tell the story, I think, in the book about one of the churches I pastored, and things were starting to roll pretty well. So I decided to do an experiencing God study with them. I don't know
Hmm.
if you're familiar with that, but
Blackaby?
yeah, we did that a lot, and always had good success. He's somewhat of a mystic for a
Mm.
Southern Baptist, um, and so I, I started sharing, and my thing is to have people share, from their story or from their heart.
Yep.
And in that group was a 90-year-old lady that was she was the matriarch of the church.
Mhm.
She was the Sunday school teacher for 60 years or whatever, and had, knew everything about the Bible, was the person at the church. But when I said, "Can you share something about your life, in that area or whatever?" And it looked like I was holding a gun to her head,
Mm.
because that's not the tradition. That's not the norm,
Yeah.
to open up. And I think it was kind of at that point that I realized, sometimes if we can just kind of fake it, get through this, put on a good show at church, then, that even though we're just pushing things down, we're not really doing anything good.
Mhm.
It at least gives the impression that we
Yeah.
are.
Yeah. That's so true. So one of the other comments you make in the book is that the American church isn't very good at community. I was wondering if you could talk to me more about that because I find it really interesting and always
Mhm.
have how an institution that quite literally prides itself on its mastery of community, right? We have Sunday worship services where everybody gathers as a community. We have Sunday school classes where people gather, Bible studies, prayer groups, community dinners, all the different things. I find it interesting and really troubling that an institution that's all about community in
Mhm.
reality can be really bad at it to the point where the outlets of community tend to wound and hurt so many people who end up finding themselves out in this desert, out in this wilderness, whatever. So maybe talk to us about what you mean by the church not doing community very well, because even as I think about it, I look back over my own life, a lot of my deepest wounds from the church come from the places where I was gathered in the most intense community.
Mhm. Yeah. So it's not to say that in some small groups and some contemplative groups that there's not some good community happening. I
Sure.
know
Yep.
that. Um, but for the most part, as an organization, we do what's most expedient for the organization.
Mm.
70% of the money, like we talked about, goes to those things and producing the show. And already told you about Sarah Bessie's comment that we just
Yep.
don't have time
Mhm.
for it. So it becomes kind of a faux community. And a lot of times, especially evangelical churches, have a common enemy intimacy that Brene Brown talks about, where it's not necessarily about, um, you know, healing each other, helping each other. It's
Mm.
more about we hate the same people, even if
Yeah.
that's just the devil,
Mhm.
even if it's just Satan or something like that, or we hate the other party, or we're better than the Methodists, or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, it's a common enemy and intimacy.
Mm.
For the most part, the church is still the most segregated hour of the week.
Mhm.
Um, and so uh, a lot of bypassing that goes on, like we mentioned before. We see God is in control. It's going to work out okay. And we never really get to the root issues. So,
Mm.
in my mind, one of my hot buttons is trunk or treat because we take people out of their real community where they live
Yep.
and bring them to the church to do trunk or treat
Right.
instead of trick or treating in their own,
Community,
maybe
yeah.
so we can control it or something like that. But all of this stuff, together in the second chapter, we talked about addictions. It
Mhm.
creates addictions. We become addicted to church. Um, there's a codependency there. Um, Even as pastors, we were addicted to it. We're addicted to the adrenaline rush,
Yeah.
the feedback, and so on. And so it's really more like a dysfunctional family.
Mm.
It's really more like a sick body than it is something healthy. And so that's the biggest thing. People say, uh, "I need community," and we're hardwired for connection. We know that, right?
Mhm.
We're hardwired for connection, and they say, "I need community." But
Mm.
then Jason Elam and I, Jason most
Mhm.
likely, Jason and I were doing podcasts together for a while, and he would interview me and I'd interview him. And he looked at me one day and he said, "This feels like, community. It feels like church."
Mm.
Um, and I said, it does. I mean, we were interviewing people about racism and things like that. But we were having deep conversations. We were bringing up our past hurts.
Yeah.
We were healing together, encouraging each other, all those things we should be doing. And you realize some of that unorchestrated community you find, we call it out in the desert, is way more real than anything I experienced before when I was playing church.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not, it's really hard, I think, for people to understand that I'm not just bashing church. I'm just
Mhm.
saying it's not working. It's a
Yeah.
system that doesn't work. It doesn't produce real community.
Yeah.
And I'd love to talk to people about that, but it's very strong anyway, very strong.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that's it's a perfect segue actually into the next thing I wanted to ask you because you take a lot of heat on social media from people who think you want to just see the church demolished. Because
Right.
every day I see somebody come at you all upset and angry because they think that you think they think you want to see the church go away. But what you really want, and you say this again and again in the book, you've said it already, in our conversation here, is you want to see the church reimagined. You want to
Mhm.
see the church rethought. And so I was wondering if we could maybe just talk for a moment. I'm sure that you've put a lot of thought into this and you and Laura together, but what does it look like in your mind to reimagine church? Like what aspects of the church need like fresh reimagination breathed into them in order to maybe to be all that it can be, all that it was, all that it has the potential to be?
Yeah. So um first, to connect to that, we
Mhm.
need to imagine what real community is. Like we mentioned before, it makes time for my grief.
Yeah.
It doesn't bypass my issues.
Hmm.
It deals with them. Um, I think one of the things is to disband the organization,
Hmm.
but I think that the trouble people have with reimagining is they look at it in a framework of an organization and they associate it with a building.
Hmm.
Carl Jung talked about the giant turd that fell on the cathedral. I don't know if you ever heard that before,
No, I haven't.
but I think it was part of his imagination about um, re-engineering. To re-engineer, you have to totally take it apart.
Yeah.
Um, in the pandemic, I think we learned what's important. um, because people couldn't go to church for a certain amount of time. We also found out how determined people were to be selfish and things like that as well. But I think somewhere in there and in these deconstruction circles and the places out in the desert, we're kind of learning what real community is.
Mm,
And I want to say it's possible. It's a very simple thing. It has to do with, Laura talks about if you were to interview Laura, she talks about coming out in her deconstruction and having those big questions like, who am I?
mhm.
What do I like to do? What do I believe?
Yeah,
What do I believe?
yeah,
Um, but I would say, what feeds your soul, um, what helps you heal, what does your inner knowing say?
mm,
And I would say start being that.
mm,
And when you do that, it becomes pretty simple, I think,
yeah,
and uninvolved, and it doesn't take a lot of money. But it's simply, being with your family, it's being with friends, it's um, asking questions,
mhm,
asking big questions, asking deep questions, and then maybe more than anything, it's about listening
yeah,
to each other.
yeah.
Those Benedictine sisters, although they're probably mad because I'm writing this book, because they're a part of an organized religious system, but um, they taught me deep listening. And it's the greatest gift anyone's ever given me, to
Yeah,
be able to listen to someone and really hear them. And I think that's what we need as much as anything.
yeah. No, that's really good. I think we've, and I'm sure you would feel this as a former pastor, that for a long time, like you come to this place where you feel like church is the only place where you can find community. And I
Hmm.
know for me, like the thought of leaving church was horrifying because like all of my relationships are in the church. All of my outlets for community are in the church, whether it be
Hmm.
a Bible study or prayer meeting or Sunday morning, whatever it is. Like that's where I go to be with people and to meet with people. And what I'm
Hmm.
finding now is, having been apart from that for so long and apart from those former tribes, there's so many other aspects of community that are available that I think are much deeper than a lot of the things I experienced. Like you said, I mean, there's been wonderful experiences in the church that I had of community, and wouldn't
Hmm.
trade any of those for the world. But there's also been ones that have fallen way short. And for the ones that have fallen way short out here in the desert, the wilderness, whatever, I found so many other ways to connect with people and to really have deep and meaningful relationships. I'm sure you can relate to it with the desert sanctuary. It's very similar with my podcast. Like I've met so many amazing people, and
Hmm.
we have conversations like this, whether it be in a group setting or one-on-one, whatever, where I feel really connected to people, and they really help me process my baggage. They help me process my grief. I mean, just a
Hmm.
couple weeks ago, I sat down with somebody for the podcast, and I just opened up to them. I said, "I have some really personal things I want to share with you on
Hmm.
recording because I feel like other people are going to benefit from this." And I shared just really deep things going on in my heart and my soul. And this person is like trained in meditation and mindfulness and Buddhism and things. And she really talked to me on a level that nobody else really talked to me, but met my grief with wide open arms and helped me walk through it. And I was like, this,
Hmm.
like you said with Jason, like this is community. Like,
Hmm.
this is what it's all about, is somebody making
Yeah.
space for my grief, not
Right.
judging me, willing to go off of the agenda that maybe we had to help me process through this thing. And I think it's so good. It's so
Yeah,
good.
it is. It is. And
Yeah,
it's not all in one place. It's not all orchestrated.
that's right.
It happens
It's
organically.
not in the bulletin, right?
Right.
We're gonna
Yeah, it
hit this in.
happens as we move through life, and it's a beautiful thing. It really is.
It really is. All right, Carl. So one last thing. This book obviously was a very personal book that you and Laura wrote, and your hearts are in there all over
Hmm.
the place. And I was wondering if you could close us out by sharing something from the book, whatever part of the book kind of speaks to you the most in this moment, in this season of your life, that you could pass along and share with our listeners, and maybe provide a small amount of commentary on it as well.
Yeah, hopefully I can find it and you have a good editor where you can.
I can cue some music right now.
Yeah. Albert Einstein said the important thing is to never stop questioning.
Mm,
We believe differently than we did 10 years ago. When we honestly let ourselves be curious, we found deeper and better answers.
mhm,
Sometimes the answers were amazingly simple, but often they were nuanced and mysterious and complicated. We are so glad we asked those questions.
mm,
We would have never navigated the stroke recovery with my old understanding. The key to discovering beauty and truth is to remain curious, not defend what we already know.
mm,
We can't solve the problems and challenges of the 21st century with old ideas. We can't cling to beliefs and ideas just because the group we are familiar with believes that way.
mm,
As the world evolves, our understanding of it has to move with it, or we will find ourselves somewhat irrelevant to the world around us. There's no simple catchphrase answers anymore.
mm,
Many of many of these things are complicated, and when we try to oversimplify them, we end up missing the target completely. Solving big problems is scary because we have to leave the comfort zone of our answers and compromise and cooperate with others to find the best solutions.
mm,
It's really always been this way. The problems are simply different these days.
mm,
We're not asking you to give up anything, but question and consider everything.
mm,
Evolve, and if your religion survives, then so be it. If it doesn't survive, then maybe you never needed it anyway.
mm,
We wish you well on your journey. Be where you are and be who you are, Karl and Laura Forehand. So
mm,
that's how we kind of closed out the book.
mm. I love that. Just be who you are, be where you are. I think
Yeah.
that's the freedom, right? I mean, how many of us longed for that freedom in church? I know I did. I mean, just the constant desire to just be accepted and welcomed for who I was, where I was with my questions. And
Mhm,
what you just read is what so many people are longing for. So well done.
mhm.
Well done.
Thank you.
All right, Carl, we're just about out of time. But as always, this has been a real treat. So thank you so much for joining me. And thank you for your and Laura's work in this book.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. And real quick, is there anywhere you want to point our listeners to online where they can go to interact with you and your work? You mentioned the Desert Sanctuary. I don't know if you want to mention that to our listeners.
Yeah, everything's called the Desert Sanctuary. So Facebook and so on,
Mhm.
the blog on Pathos, and then our podcast. But if you go to Karl Forehand, Karl's with a K and forehands like in tennis. If you go to karlforehand.com, it points to everything, and including my books, which are on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and so forth and so on. So if you visit my Facebook page, you can't miss whatever I'm promoting because I'm kind of ridiculous with it sometimes.
It's all there. Well, I'll put all the links in the show notes for everybody.
All right, thanks,
Awesome.
man.
Thanks, Carl.